of John Pemberton, who's an associate of the Centre for Humanities Engaging Science and Society, CHESS, at Durham University, and also a member of the Knowledge for Use programme and the Society for the Philosophy of Time. So we're going into some quite serious philosophy tonight, but I've read John's paper, very accessible, very interesting, a chance to recap on some paradoxes from the ancients and how they've been addressed more recently. And we're going to look at the nature of change and the bringing about of change, which connects, of course, to causation, what that means, whether it exists, and how we should think about it. So John's going to talk about why our account of change matters, making some reference to his own work on applied causation, including some work with Nancy Cartwright. So very happy to have you here, John. Thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Nick, and thanks everybody for coming. It's lovely to be back in sunny Barnes again. And so you've had, as Nick mentioned, a number of exciting talks recently. The artificial intelligence, the one on delusion, you've got the one on flirting coming up, and they're wonderful, sexy, contemporary topics. And I've chosen to talk about change. So why would I focus on change? Well, change I want to kind of suggest in this talk is equally exciting and interesting topic, but I think in perhaps a rather different way from some of these other contemporary ones. Change has been a central topic of Western philosophy really since the beginning, what we might call the beginning of Western philosophy, at least with the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, which I'm going to talk about a little. And one of the reasons it was so central is because change turns out to be absolutely key to the nature of being. Particularly the nature of the being of ordinary objects. And insofar as human beings are physical beings, ordinary, then it's key to our own being as well. So it's also a continuing core of metaphysics up to and including today. So it's had this long history, which I'll try to indicate something of. And so to understand change is to understand something about this program of Western philosophy and how it's evolved. And it has, as Nick mentioned, I'm going to mention at the end some important practical implications. I'm going to say a little bit about those. So that's roughly what I'm going to talk about today. So roughly, what is change? Just very roughly. Roughly, well, to have change, you need difference, right? It's no good having a duck and then a duck, or a dice and then a dice. That wouldn't be change. You have to have two different things, but difference itself isn't enough. Have a duck over here and then later a dice over there. It's not really change. You need some connection between the two. So generally you need some underlying sort of a thing. So you might start with a green banana, turn up a yellow banana. That's more like what we're going to think of as change. Right, well that's fairly straightforward. So that all seems very easy. So what sort of views then could really people have about such a simple idea? Yeah. So here's Heraclitus, Greek about 500 BC in Ephesus, part of a place in Turkey. And his view is this, that everything is changing. The world is a maelstrom of dynamic change. Nothing ever is, he says. Everything is always becoming. Fire is the fundamental substance of which the universe is made, and everything is born out of death, right? So he was a man who thinks everything's changed, and he also believed that strife is justice, right? And he was a great believer in war. So he might not have been first pick for your Barnes dinner parties, but he certainly has interesting views. So he was followed 50 years later, Elea, which is a Greek province in Italy, by Parmenides, who concerned himself with what he thought was the problem of change. As we've seen, you can't have a duck and a duck, that's not change. What you have to have is something to turn into a duck that's not a duck. So you start with the not being of a duck, okay, and then you have the being of a duck. Well, the being of a duck's quite clear. you have a kind of a determinate idea of what a duck is. It's kind of a fluffy and yellow, and it has a couple of legs and a couple of feathers, a couple of wings. But what is not being a duck, right? I mean, how do we conceive of that? And the problem with not being a duck is it's completely open-ended and indeterminate. We don't have any picture of it, right? And the Greeks were very concerned about this. And once we conceptualize not being within our schema, then it seems we've got to conceptualize the being of not being, right? And that seemed kind of paradoxical. So Parmenides, in his famous poem, of which we have extracts but not the whole, said we should follow the way of truth and not the way of opinion. So he moves us onto the kind of a linguistic notion in some of the first moves in that direction. As with all sort of, or nearly all philosophers through the ages, he was looking for certainty in some place, and he was to find it within truth and within the nature of language. He says we cannot speak of what is not, okay? So we can talk about things that don't exist, but it's really just loose talk. It's really kind of talking about illusions. That's the way of opinion. And since we can't truly speak of what is not, we can't really speak of difference. So Parmenides' view is this, that nothing changes in the world, right? So here then we have the kind of the two polar opposites placed. Heraclitus, everything is changing. Parmenides, nothing is changing. At the beginning of this massively creative period of thought through the ancient Greece. So Zeno of Elea was a young compatriot of Parmenides. He was a supporter of him. And he, in his own way, was a genius. He set up a new way of arguing philosophy by creating a number of paradoxes. He had 4 paradoxes of motion. He also had some paradoxes to do with plurality. And I'm going to just talk through a couple of the ones on motion, which are going to be most relevant for our case. Here's probably the most famous of the paradoxes. And here we have Achilles, who was the hero of the games, of course, the fastest man in Greece, and he was going to be chasing a tortoise, okay? And the tortoise, to be level things up a little bit, was given a head start. And so Achilles races up the tortoise, and the tortoise is racing off as fast as it can. And so at some point, fairly soon, Achilles reaches the point at which the tortoise started off. But the tortoise has moved off, of course, okay? So Achilles then races to the point which the tortoise has then managed to reach. Okay. But of course, again, the tortoise has moved off. And so what we find is every time that Achilles races to the point at which the tortoise was, it's moved. So Zeno concludes, there's really, Achilles, it looks like, has this infinite regress where he's not really ever going to reach the tortoise. So contemporary solutions to this, of course, are found in, at least putative solutions are found in contemporary mathematics, where we appeal to the convergence of infinite series, right? Convergence of infinite series we now, in contemporary mathematics, suppose can converge, and this is a series that converges. And in a way, that's a nice solution. It wasn't available to the Greeks, but we must remember that even this solution does appeal to a number of assumptions about the continuity of time and the continuity of space, which are in themselves controversial. So this should be seen as a solution, not the solution to the paradox. Here's the paradox I want to spend a little bit more time on, and to kick it off here, and I'll go on to it later, the arrow paradox. So here's somebody firing an arrow. And here it is at this particular point in time, this particular instant, okay? And Zeno says, look, the arrow never moves at that instant. It's here, right? Why did it not move at a particular instant? Well, an instant is, by definition, the shortest period of time. Okay. So if the arrow could be in 2 places in the same instant, then you could split the instant. You'd have a bit of the instant where it was here, and then a bit of the instant where it was there. But that would contradict your definition of an instant. Right? So the arrow can only ever be in one place at one time. So the arrow doesn't move in any instant. Well, look, if it doesn't move in any instant, then it never moves. So that is actually a very clever paradox, and I'll leave you to think about it a little bit, and then I'll come up with, once we've talked a little bit more about some other topics, I'll come back to suggest a couple of solutions. Plato, of course, was one of the two colossuses of the ancient world who lived shortly afterwards in Athens. And one of his great contributions to philosophy, which has really, I mean, it's difficult to think that philosophy through the Western world would have been the same without Plato's theory of forms. So Plato believed that when we have chairs, when we have horses, when we have things like the colour red, that we have ideals of these, right? So that, and he believed these really existed. So Plato believes that there is an ideal world, literally a kind of a platonic heaven in which one finds ideals of things like a chair, so an ideal chair, an ideal horse, okay? And this world, this theory of forms, this platonic heaven, is unchanging. And this world in which we inhabit, the physical world, is not as real as the world of forms. The chairs that we find in this world are kind of imitations of the ideal chair. And they're imperfect in that sense. So we live in this sort of secondary shadow world in a way. And this shadow world is changing. So we see here Plato's comparison of these two things. And he takes the unchanging world to be the one that's is more real. And this is Plato's move towards rationalism, the way that we should, that Plato seeks to gain certainty in the world is not through the sensory perception world. It is through the world of thought and by abstraction into this world of ideals and ideal forms. It's through rationalism rather than empiricism. It's kicking off a wonderful, rich debate through much of the Western philosophy's history. So the other great colossus of this period was Plato's junior and student Aristotle, who was a wonderful philosopher, and we think of him as being one of the great philosophers. But we should also recognize he was, as well and separately from that in a way, a great biologist. He was the father of biology. Some of his achievements in biology were not replicated for hundreds of years after his death. He was had an extraordinary ability in that sphere too. But because he was a biologist as well as a philosopher, he wanted to create an ontology, an account of the world, which explained, which was adequate for the natural sciences, for biology. So his account of the world needed to accommodate biology. And biology is a world of change, of course. And so he needs to argue against Parmenides then, who's the main sort of existing authority for the reality of change. Okay. So Aristotle, I think it's fair to say, is the great figure in presenting accounts of change. And so let me outline his main account. So his main innovation was this. He said, look, whenever you have change, you must have some substratum of change. There must be something which exists throughout the change. It's there at the beginning and it's there at the end. So in this classic example of the building of a house, you start off with some building materials, and the building materials exist through the period of change until you get the house. Okay, Aristotle abstracts that kind of the picture there into a kind of a formulation, a general formulation for all these types of change, in which you have a patient, a substratum, something which exists through the change. In this one, it was the building materials. Okay, and you have at the start of that something which doesn't have a form. So you have the building materials without the form of the house, and then they change to having the building materials with the form of the house. Okay. So you have this change, and this is a process of change. So this is a general account of change. And one of the great achievements of this account is it answers the problem of change that Parmenides and other Greeks were so concerned about. That here you don't start with non-existence to core of a house, right? You start rather with something which doesn't have the form of the house. You have the building materials there, they don't have the form of the house, but it's not non-existent to the core. And that was an important step in changing the nature of debate. So Aristotle is thought, I think, rightly to have offered us, through the entire history of Western philosophy, the only plausible definition of change as such. He says change, this is the actualization of what is potentially quasi-potential. Now that is pretty meaningless unless you have it decoded, but Aristotle's ontology was founded on this notion of what is actual, what is really here, what is potential, what might be. Okay. So in the case of a house, there's a sense in which the building materials are potentially a house, in a very natural sense. They could be turned into a house by the builder. Okay. But that isn't the form of potentiality which Aristotle is pointing to in this definition. When the house is actualized, it's no longer potentially a house in a sense. It no longer can become a house. It's already a house. Okay. So he is pointing us to the point in time before the house becomes into existence, where it's still potential qua potential. Okay. And the actuality of the building at that point for Aristotle is the changing of the building materials at that stage. Okay. So it is the building of the house, right? It is during the building period. So he's pointing us at this changing itself rather than what results from the change. And he grounds the reality of the change then on the reality of the builder's power to build. Okay. So that's kind of like a rather quick description of what's of the position. But hopefully it's given you a kind of an idea of Aristotle's notion of change. So Aristotle then was really the dominant force in philosophy through the next 1,500 years. I mean, he was the orthodox view, and for many years, I'm sure you know, there was a period after the Greeks which was less creative, and although there are other ideas given the time constraints, what I'm going to do is leap forward to the contemporary period and have a look at the ontology which is orthodox today and how that provides an account of change. And I'm going to compare that with Aristotle's view to give us an idea. Aristotle really was the orthodox view in Western philosophy through to about the mid-17th century with the coming of the new sciences. So the contemporary view today then is, in my view at least, the neo-Humean picture of people like Bertrand Russell and David Lewis. Okay, what's this picture look like? Well, here's what Lewis says. All there is to the world is a vast mosaic of local matters of fact, just one little thing and then another. We have a geometry, a system of spatio-temporal distances between points, and at each of those points we have properties which need nothing bigger than a point at which to be instantiated, and that is all. So what does that mean? Okay. So to try and paint a picture of this, I think the best thing to do is think of yourselves as wanting to create such a world, right? So supposing you are God and you decided that you want to build one of these worlds, how would you go about that? Okay. Well, one of the ways you could not naturally do it is the first thing you would do is you get a series of helpers and you get them to build each point in space-time. Okay, so you would get them to build what that looks like, and you construct them, and you have a big pile of them. And there's a second step. What you do is you take your canvas of space and time, so it has 3 dimensions of space and dimension of time. It's a huge canvas, and then you compose these mosaic tiles, these tiles of each of these space-time points onto this canvas. Okay, and that is the world. And the whole thing is created, start to finish, right, at the beginning. And so let me then talk about what time looks like in this. I haven't talked about time yet, I've talked about change. The two are intimately related. And what is in this contemporary picture we start off with time as a dimension of the mosaic canvas. It's a kind of fourth dimension, if you like, or four-dimensional canvas. And the world comprises the whole of that four dimensions. So time is there from the outset. It's built into the base of the ontology from the start. All times are equally real, whether they, whatever, throughout that infinite period, they're there, created at the start by God, and that's it. That's the canvas, that's the whole world. So what does change look like in that picture? Well, recall that we started off saying that change must be something like how a thing is at one time, then how a thing is at a later time. You have a banana that's yellow, and then a banana that's green, and a banana that's yellow. Okay. So if that's what change is to be, then how's that going to occur in this canvas, which is just this mosaic of tiles? Okay. We don't seem to have any things as yet. So you need to construct things from these tiles. So here's Russell's account of that. A common sense thing, a persisting object through time, a banana that goes through time, is a dense infinity of adjacent tiles that exhibit quasi-permanence. Let me cast that out. You're looking at this mosaic, and you see a kind of string of yellow, soft, slightly bent objects that's going through. You see a tile, sort of infinite number of contiguous tiles next to each other, which have those properties, right? And they're all similar to each other. Now they can change a little bit. So the color can change a little bit, the shape can change a little bit, the hardness can change a little bit as you go through, but there can never be any big discontinuities. You can't suddenly change from a banana into a cricket ball, right? So picking out this line of tiles is for the Lewisians, for the Russellians, for the Neo-Humeans, to identify an existing, persisting object, a chair, a ball, you and I, right, would be equally picked out by such methods. So the tiles themselves, notice, cannot change, right? They were there, they were created at the beginning. I mean, so they were just put there. There's nothing about those tiles which changes, right? They're just there. They are, so there's no change in the basic ontology of a Neo-Humean world, okay? Change exists only at this derivative level of these constructs of things which exist through time. And there's no necessary connection between any of the points. So time starts off, in this view, as basic and prior to change. And I want to compare that view in order to kind of give a feel for the distinction between these two views with Aristotle's view. So if you're God in Aristotle's world, wanting to create Aristotle's world, then you need to do this. You need to start off by creating things that can change, right? Things that can go through series of change, things that are changeable and changing. Okay. You need to create those objects, and then you need to compose them, a number of them together, in a spatial region. Okay. And then you set them off, and then they can change through stages of change. Okay. So at each stage the world is changing and it's coming to be in a real sense in this Aristotelian world. There are things there which are really changing. How do we get time into that picture? Remember in the Neo-Humean view we started with time. There's no time yet in Aristotle's view. Okay. And in Aristotle's view then we get time like this. We find a process within this world of changing objects which is regular and consistent and repetitive, ideally, and then we use that as a measure of time, right? So the obvious examples for the Greeks at that time were the rotation of the Earth each day. So we were able to look at that as one of those processes, and we use that repetition day by day to create a number. We count the days, okay, and so we create time as a measure of change. So we add, in a sense, time into the picture, a picture in which change already exists. So in this picture, time is derivative, it's created by us, in a sense, whereas the change is basic. Well, recently, of course, we could use pendulums, as in the contemporary, as in the development of the clocks, the grandfather clocks and so forth, as another kind of process which is regular and we could count, and more recently, of course, atomic clocks. So let's go back then to the paradox motion and look at the neo-Humean solution first, because this tells us a lot about what they think will change. So here's what Russell says: motion consists merely in the occupation of different places at different times. So the arrow is here, then it's here, and then it's here, and that's all there is to it, okay? We must entirely reject the notion of state of motion. There is no transition from place to place, no consecutive moment or consecutive position, no such thing as velocity. No such thing as velocity, right? Velocity is eliminated from the ontology, and that's celebrated as achieving a huge, an important parsimony. And if you think about the mosaic ontology, well, what else could you have as motion other than things occupying different places, different points at different times? So how does Aristotle, though, answer this? Well, he has an arrow which actually exists through stages of change, actually exists through time, and so he can have a change of position for the same object. And so it has this potential of having real velocity. And I think that that was Aristotle's intuitive view. We need to be careful because the ancients had a very limited concept of velocity. It was not yet, even by Aristotle's close, really, average velocity was not really something they fully grasped. So we need to be careful about being anachronistic here. But we can take, though, a contemporary view here, on top of the Aristotelian view, as it were, to take a contemporary Aristotelian perspective. And we, of course, can define velocity in a very precise mathematical sense. And as we need to use the differential calculus, which, of course, didn't come into the mid-17th century with Newton and Leibniz. But we can define the notion of velocity at an instant. And of course, when you're driving along in your car and you look at your speedometer, well, that's what you have, your speed at that instant, okay? And when you're cycling along on your bicycle, okay, as you, I hope, weren't on the way down in the rain here today, you are really moving, right, at each point in time, okay? You actually have real velocity. So here's the solution that we might offer for Aristotle to the arrow paradox. The arrow is moving at every instant. It exists through time and it's moving at every instant. But to say it's moving at every instant isn't to say that it moves in any instant. To say it moves in an instant would be to say it could be in two places in that instant. It doesn't need to be in two places in an instant in order to be moving at any instant. Okay. So it is moving at every instant, but it does not move at any instant. Okay. And that is, I think, how we should think of a kind of a neo-Aristotelian solution to the arrow paradox. There's some papers on their website which Nick mentioned. So let me move on to causation very briefly. Okay, so causation is bringing about a change. In bringing about a change, causation is the modern term in the sense of how they think, how it's thought about. So causation involves at minimum something like a cause being followed by a later effect. We could think of this as a law of causality or a causal relation, if you like. And here are very everyday examples. You swallow an aspirin, you ease your headache a little bit later. You turn the key in your car, and on comes the engine a little bit later. And in the sciences, in biology, you have neurotransmitter particles coming out of one end of a synapse, a neuron into the synapse, and that causes adjacent neurons to fire. In engineering, you spark hydrocarbons, and that causes an explosion, as in your car engine. In economics, maybe you increase interest rates in order to slow down the economy. These are all good examples of causal relations. And here's the contemporary Humean view, put very simply, very briefly, that causation isn't actually a connection between two separate tiles. It is just a matter of contiguity and constant conjunction of similar types. So we may have a drop in the atmospheric pressure and then later a storm, and that is really that constant conjunction is really the basis of the causation. There is, of course, a celebrated problem here. You may have this, that the atmospheric pressure causes the barometer to drop, then one has this constant conjunction between firstly the barometer dropping and then the storm occurring. But of course, that constant conjunction isn't causal. It's not, you know, by adjusting the barometer, you can't cause a storm. Okay, so we need to distinguish between causal and non-causal constant conjunctions. You need to grasp the nature of some privileged sort of conjunction which is going to do the job for you. And that is a huge debate within the contemporary metaphysics about what sort of privilege is required for to achieve causation rather than merely regularity. Russell had another objection to causation, causal relations in particular, diachronic causal relations. The law of causality, he said, in a wonderful quote, 1913, I believe, like much that passes muster amongst philosophers, is a relic of a bygone age, surviving like the monarchy, only because it is erroneously supposed to do no harm. Okay, great, a great opponent of the monarchy. So why did Russell believe that? When in his 1913 paper he sets out this argument. The laws of causation are problematic for this reason. When we take the set of real numbers, there's no next number. Take the number 2. What's the next number? 2.1? No, it can't be 2.1 because there's 2.01 and that's in between. So is it 2.01? No, because there's 2.001 and that's in between. There's no next number. However far down, however close you try to get to the number 2, you never get next to number 2. There's always numbers in between. So if time's continuous, if time's like that set of real numbers, then if you have an event at 2, you have the cause happening at time 2, then the effect cannot happen at next time because there is no next time, right? So Russell says, look, there has to be then a time gap between the two, right? You have the cause here, then the effect afterwards, and there has to be some finite time between the two. But he says that's absurd, right? I mean, you have the cause and then all of a sudden nothing happens. Tweedledum, tweedledum, and then all of a sudden, a bit later on, the effect leaps into. How could that be, right? This is an absurdity. So this is my talk. I'm going to give you my own view very briefly on this. I think that Russell was not right, that this leap through time for no causation is indeed absurd. Another recent paper. I believe and argue that there is always a process underlying any causal relation. Okay, so that when you take an aspirin and later you relieve your headache, it's not that there's some brute relation between the swallowing and the relief. There's a process. The aspirin goes down your esophagus, it dissolves in your stomach, salicylic acid goes in your blood up to the brain, salicylic acid in the brain reduces the swelling of certain brain cells. It's a process which goes on through time. And it tells acting through time, each of what the aspirin does, and changing through time. Okay, so this is a kind of a changing view of change, right? And this view underwrites my practical work on causation. So in the final few minutes, which I have in this talk, I want to then just talk briefly about some of my practical work. So this is a kind of a little step change as we work on. So Nancy Cartwright is a contemporary philosopher of science, and she has provided over the period, certainly since '83, the last 40 odd years, a radical challenge to the new human consensus. She's been a voice in favour of taking causation seriously. Causation is irreducible on Cartwright's view. No causes in, no causes out in her 1983 book, How Laws of Physics Lie. And I think it's certainly not too strong to say that Cartwright is certainly one of the most influential of living philosophers. So it's been my great good fortune to be friends with Cartwright and my great privilege to write with Cartwright, and the subjects upon which we have written have been these subjects concerned with change. So powers, which bring about change mechanisms, laws of succession, and causal processes. So we've written on this subject of change together. These ones are papers, this one's a book, and this book, which is we're currently busy writing and finishing off. So this book then is something I'd just like to mention. It's actually a practitioner's guide. So Cartwright started off really working on abstract ideas, she's always erred more towards the philosophy of science than metaphysics, but she's worked on causation, on mechanisms, on somewhat more abstract ideas. But in her later period, she has shifted to very practical questions, and practical questions of how to help people implement policy. And so the book that we're writing is actually a practitioner's guide for how to design and implement policy. So we do start off by setting out an account of causation. It's a very pluralistic, very pragmatic account, which derives from methods, the methods we actually find in practice for people dealing with causation, people in engineering, people in economics, people in other sciences. We look at the patterns for how they deal with causation, and then we construct out of that a kind of a pluralistic account of causation. And we argue for the need to recognize the underlying activities in each causal step. The activities which, in a sense, are what drives the process. And that, bringing into perspective, into picture, that process means that we need to bring into picture as well what it is that takes part in those processes, right? What brings about the change. So this demands a respect for local ontology, for the local context, what's actually there. So let me just look at a couple of very brief examples. So in Tennessee in the mid-1990s, they had a problem with their education results, and they decided they needed to introduce a policy to try and improve those results. And the policy they decided upon was to reduce class sizes. Well, that seems like a really good, intuitive sort of policy that would kind of be likely to work. And they introduced it, and it did work. Okay, Tennessee results were good, exam results improved. And so a short while later, California thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. Let's try that too. So there was a class size reduction program at really quite considerable cost in California to reduce class sizes. Okay. But in California, it failed. So why did it fail? Well, here are two reasons it failed. Firstly, there were no spare teachers in California. Right? So when they reduced class sizes, what they needed to do was recruit from a pool of people that didn't have the experience or the caliber of the existing teaching pool. So it diluted the quality of the teaching pool. Secondly, they didn't have the spare classroom space in California. So rather than being able to just accommodate them in the same timetables, what they needed to do was often reschedule timetables in order to, and that was disruptive for pupils. So what they've discovered was rather improving exam results, the program actually made exam results considerably worse. Now, I'm going to offer one other example as I try to hit my time targets here. In Tamil Nadu in India, as with throughout the Indian subcontinent, there was at the beginning of this millennium still a considerable problem with malnutrition. Child malnutrition led to considerable illness and often mortality. And in Tamil Nadu, they introduced a program which was carefully designed to try and help this by firstly educating mothers, often whilst they were still pregnant, and then providing small amounts, very small amounts of financial subsidy to help them in the early period when the children were still very young. And this program proved very successful, and it did have the evidence showed significant improvement on the malnutrition of young infants. So Bangladesh thought, well, this looks like a good idea. We should try this, okay? And they introduced Bangladesh nutrition program in Bangladesh. Why did it fail in Bangladesh? Well, in Bangladesh, there's simply a different culture, right? In Bangladesh, it's not the mother who dictates spending decisions of the household, it's the mother-in-law, typically. And so educating the mothers and providing them with finance simply didn't succeed in the same way as it did in Tamil Nadu. And again, the project failed. So here's the generic question. Will a policy work in a new place proposed? You suppose it's worked in some place and then you want to transfer it. And that, I think, is an interesting and very practical question. And the answer that we give, I guess, in our book is this. You must have regard to the nature of the causal process by which the policy is intended to work. What it's actually going to do. You've got to identify the aspects of the context in which you're going to introduce it, the specific detailed aspects, the things which are actually intended to produce the process and help it to occur when you introduce your cause. And you need to ask if you can see how these were in place looking back at how it's worked in the past, and you need to ask the question, are these factors in place in a new context? Okay. And you need to respect that local ontology, which is a Cartwright adage of mine. So the book sets out then the framework for thinking through this in specific cases. And I just want to note that these kind of practical methods follow from the recognition that the causal relations that we find is underwritten by a causal process. So the causal relation isn't just a brute relationship between introducing a policy, educating mothers, and the reduction in child malnutrition. There is a process which goes on in between, which needs to be respected and thought about in each case. And so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so I just want to suggest that is one kind of way in which this change comes out, and how we understand change, how it can have practical implications. So final slide then, in summary, I've argued that and suggested that change is a central core issue for philosophy through the ages, and I've sketched some history and some headline issues. I've suggested my overview that change involves the process of changing through time. It's an Aristotelian view, and contrasted that with many of the contemporary views which treat change, bringing about a change as step changes, about causation. And I pointed to one reason at least why this matters for understanding causation and hence practical ethics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was an impressive amount to get through in 45 minutes. I do want to open it up for questions from the audience. And we have Adrian who will dash around with a mic. So do give some thought to whether you'd like to ask or state something. But I wondered if you could give us just a little bit more context on the ancients here, John. And
sure.
You mentioned Parmenides. He seemed like a lively character, a bad dinner party guest. What was at stake as to whether things changed or were just different at different times? Why did it matter to them? Why does it matter to you and other philosophers now?
Okay. So Parmenides was, like I think most philosophers, concerned with finding certainty, some basis for certainty. And if you look at most philosophers through the ages, what you discover is that that's their drive. In a sense, I think their driving ambition to find a hook upon which they can, something about which they can be certain, the starting point for their whole set of beliefs about what the world is. So Parmenides was aiming to do that, and he found it in truth. But he worried that if one had change, indeed if one had a plurality of objects, his belief in there being no change with his belief in monism, belief that there was only one thing. Then you thought that one would come up with this dangerous position in which one has a world in which one cannot have truth, right? Because one would be talking about things which one couldn't really talk about. They wouldn't really be true. So if in fact we are constrained to talking about the physical world as it exists now, we wouldn't be able to speak truth. Okay? For Parmenides, that was unacceptable. He really needed to talk truth in order to have something about which he felt certain. That was his ambition. So in order to secure that certainty, he rejects, in a sense, this world of change, this world in which we can't speak truly, as being something which is subsidiary. And in a way, I think it's right to see this as the same sort of move that Plato was making later on. It was removed from the physical world, the world which is here and now, which seemed to both of them, in a sense, to be a world of illusion, a world which was dangerous and uncertain, about which one could have no certainty. They thought they wanted to create instead this world of certainty, this world of ideals, this world that's unchanging, this world which we get into, which we can understand through our rationality rather than through our senses. So I think for Parmenides and other sort of later philosophers, that's kind of one of the reasons why they might have gone down that path of rejecting change. Yeah. So I could talk some more.
We do have a couple of questions already. I think, Adrian, we've got one just behind you in your orange top, and then one at the back.
So, where does is fundamentally your idea then about change, or to understand change and causation? You have to delve into the process that underwrites it or underlies it. Is that really sort of determinism then? Or where does determinism fit into these sorts of philosophical ideas?
Yeah, great. Thank you. I didn't catch your name, sir.
Michael.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for that question. Great question, of course.
The question of determinism, of course, is so present these days because, of course, one can't really think about the world in a contemporary context without at some stage thinking about the quantum domain. Okay.
I was going to actually say, but putting aside quantum mechanics for the moment.
Okay. So, okay, let's agree to do that, Michael. Let's move on to the classical.
Well, otherwise it just becomes
physics.
it becomes quite a difficult conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. So the way I would think about that is this: that we have the quantum domain, but in fact, it's very difficult to get objects within the quantum domain. So it's very difficult to think about classical change. In a sense, one has to make believe. I mean, often done by hand waving decoherence theories to get objects in there, and so yes, indeed, there's a challenge. So once we get into the classical domain, then I don't think then the question is, well, what do we mean by determinism? Okay, and I don't know really where to start on this. So one of the things I talk about is the deterministic nature of objects, whether objects are deterministic or not. So whether they have they have clear boundaries, for instance, and whether they have particular points in time at which objects begin to exist and cease to exist. And this was certainly the Aristotelian picture, and certainly the picture which most contemporary philosophers have. That there must be determinate points in time at which they start and finish. And I actually argue against that. I think the nature of the world of acting and changing, which I kind of think about, allows for arrangements of objects to come into existence through a process of coming to be. So that when we think about these sorts of processes, we can have a coming to be of objects. And in the period So if you think that one has a motorbike, well, it has part of a motorbike sitting there on the floor, and then the builder comes in, engineer, and he's built a motorbike, right? So you have a motorbike. Well, the motorbike then exists over here. There's a period when it didn't exist. The question is, at what point in time did the motorbike come into existence? And I think my answer is, well, it never. There was no single point in time which came into existence, right? And that leaves us then with this period of time. It's not a point in time. There must be indeterminism as to whether it existed or not. And I argue that is right, that there is deep-seated indeterminism in the world, in the nature of objects that kind of fits with my picture of change as a process which must occur through time, that there's not this step, as it were. Michael, I don't know if that was kind of like...
I was just, I don't know enough to be able to, I was just interested to sort of one hears those sorts of thoughts in terms of cause and effect is fundamentally a deterministic process.
Sure.
So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Sure. So I think, the process you allow us to move away from that. Yeah, I think you're right. I agree with that. It allows you to move away a little bit from that into a kind of more indeterministic, in a classical domain, I suppose.
Seem to be casting doubt on things now as well.
Yes. Well, the boundaries of things.
Yes, exactly. Adrian, we had a gentleman with the glasses up at the back.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. This is quite loud. My name is Romulo. Just a very quick background. I'm a biologist by training. I used to be a materialist and an atheist.
Oh, is that right?
I'm a staunch evolutionist, being a biologist, but 5 years ago I've converted to Catholicism, and now I'm an Aristotelian Thomist.
Okay.
So I'm very interested in this topic because that's what brought me to Catholicism, was studying Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas. I could make many questions, but on the topic of change within evolutionary biology, I feel that we are back to a situation that is pre-Socratic, that we have an miraculous view of biology in which things are constantly changing and there's no permanence. Even Darwin wrote about it, that species are, just a product of our imaginations because all we have are populations that are constantly changing over time. I would like your opinion on this because to me, this creates a problem of identity, right? Because the fundamental element of biology is a species, but if there's no such thing as species, then the biology becomes unintelligible. And now we have more concepts of species in biology, for example. So have you written about it? Have you thought about this problem?
Okay. Certainly, I have thought about these sorts of questions. It's interesting as to whether, in fact, evolution of the species and just move a few inches this way. Sorry, now great, excellent. So it's interesting to think about whether the evolution of the species, which means they're not fixed, does create a problem for a Christian view, or a view of there being fixed identities of horses or sheep or whatever. And certainly it was Aristotle's view, as I'm sure you know, as Aristotelian Thomist, that the horses were permanent. They always existed, and they always would exist. There was just horses. There were species that were everlasting. They didn't have a beginning, and they would come to an end. There's obviously a point at which most contemporary biologists would disagree. They take the view that evolution means that these species will come into existence and then pass out of existence. So I think it's a question of whether this view of the evolution and the changing nature of species, how threatening that is. So I'm not I don't subscribe to a Christian faith. So I'm relaxed about the idea that we can have changing species on the world, and the view I hold about change is consistent with there being species as types of things. The types of things are defined in a sense by in a pragmatic sense as to whether the species can survive, whether it has sufficient common characteristics. And so I'm afraid I probably have a view that you would not necessarily approve of, that one would have.
My problem is not with the religious view. It's just a matter of if there's no forms, because the moderns got rid of form, right?
Yeah.
So the species that they don't have an ontology, they're just constantly changing.
Yeah.
So if they don't have a form, then they are not intelligible, at least in an Aristotelian sense.
Yeah.
And that's why we come up with hundreds of concepts of species, because they are not constant over time. So I'm asking on a more ontological level.
Sure. So Robbie, have you read much of some of the recent literature on hydromorphism? Like William Simpson, for instance.
I read Dennis Walsh, for example.
Okay. Well, so I think this is a subject which is debated as to what extent one needs fixed forms. But I think a lot of, my understanding at least is that a lot of the metaphysicians would think that you could still have forms, even if one has an evolutionary species. So one could still have the form of a horse, even if horses, in a sense, came into existence, a few million years ago, and didn't exist before that. And the form would still be, in a sense, provide the identity criteria for horses and their existence criteria for when they come in and go out of existence, for instance. So I think there are different views. I mean, some people do hold the view that, in fact, Christianity was deeply challenged by the discovery of Darwin by evolution. And of course, at the time, that was a common view across the Catholic Church, that this was a deeply threatening view, and it took a very considerable length of time for Christians to come to terms with that shift. So I think what you're talking about is mentioning is an interesting question. I'm not sure I have any more straightforward answers. Thanks.
Want to continue afterwards, I think. Adrian, we have one in front of you on the left, and then one in the Okay. Is that a question as well? No. Okay.
This question is about going backwards and forwards in time. So what is the direction of time? And it's prompted by your description of the block universe, where it's all fixed in tiles, of the directions of space and time.
Well, I didn't say the direction was fixed. I said the points in space.
The point, the points is fixed.
But I don't think the direction's fixed. Just to be
fair. And the causality and change through contiguous tiles. That was my understanding of it.
Yeah.
Going from the green banana to the yellow banana.
Yeah.
And it strikes me, and I'm going to come on to your practical solution at the end, a process. It strikes me you could look at it the other way around, from the yellow banana to the green banana, from effect through to cause. Without an effect, there isn't a cause.
Yes.
So it works, symmetrical. It works both ways. As do the laws of physics, work both ways, laws of motion and so on. So I'm just wondering, in this process, whether it'd be better, I've never thought of this before, you just sparked this idea in my mind, whether it's better to start with the desired state that you want to achieve, better results in schools in California, to start at that end, rather than a theoretical solution at the front end that you picked up from somewhere else, and then work through the processes. And start at the back end, and then work through what needs to check, what you need to put in to get that design, and work back through to the core, the original cause, which might be quite different from the theoretical one. I don't know, does that make any sense?
Yes, it does. So I think that's your name.
Ian.
Ian, hi, thanks for the question. Yeah, that's really two questions. They're both very good questions. I'll try and answer them both. So I think the first question is about the direction of time. And I think that certainly in the Humean world, one has this, you build this mosaic, and it doesn't have an intrinsic time. So I think that's right. It's not, is it that the cause always follows the effect, or the effect always follows the cause? And I think that's one of the great problems which the neo-Humans grapple with, and there's some very interesting discussions on that. The point I made here, just in relation to the sort of one of the things I've been talking about, is to contrast that with the Aristotelian picture. In the Aristotelian picture, change comes before time. Right? Now, change does have an intrinsic direction because one has powers and objects which are bringing about change, and so one has a progression through stages of change, and so one can very often, if one understands the nature of the objects which are bringing about change, then one has an intrinsic direction to that change, particularly in the human field, where Aristotle was particularly concerned, where the change is driven teleologically. So I want to achieve something, so my change aims towards a teleological goal. So the Aristotelians don't have the same problem with the direction of time as the neo-Humans. Okay, so it's again a take for the kind of neo-Aristotelian box, if you like. But on the second question, should we, when we think about policies and in practice, perhaps start with the end and then work to the beginning? And if, in fact, I think there's a lot of merit in that view, that in fact, if one thinks about what one's trying to get to, then that is a very practical way of then working out, in fact, what one needs in order to get there. And in our book, that's certainly something we discuss. I don't think it's as clear as you should always start with the end and then think about the beginning, or think about the beginning and think towards the end. I think in practice, in fact, it's the middle bit that's difficult and pretty uncertain. So thinking about it both ways, starting with the end, and then working out what you needed at the beginning, and thinking about the beginning and working out what might happen at the end. Thinking about the two and then putting them together is probably a kind of what we would recommend as a kind of practical way.
I think we had a couple more hands up. We've got 3, so let's go right behind you in the middle, and then in the corner afterwards, and then back to the front.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, when you were talking about change, you talked about it in the physical sense of objects moving through time and space. And then it occurred to me, so when you talked about the Bangladesh project, which was scuppered because the mother-in-laws wouldn't allow the spending, what occurred to me then was that actually you need to think about change in terms of mental processes and belief systems and culture, which aren't measured through movement through time and space. So how does a philosophical approach, how would you tackle that? Because you can't change the nutrition of the children if you don't change the mother-in-law's thinking. Probably not very elegant, but hope you get
No, it's a really nice question. Again, I didn't catch your name, so.
Carmel.
Carmel, thanks, Carmel. So I think that's a really good question, and it comes on to some very controversial subjects about the nature of the mental, of course, of which there are, I'm not sure if you had this debated here as a subject, but certainly psychological and the kind of areas which I know you've had some meetings on. It's very controversial as to how the psychological, how beliefs and knowledge relate to the physical level. And there's certainly divergent views here. Some people's views are that, in fact, you cannot have the mental without the physical. And if one held that view, then one would say that, in fact, mental change just is physical change, right? And there are, of course, some people that say, well, no, the mental somehow has to be understood as something which is above the physical, is separate from it. So it's maybe in some sense emerges from the physical. And in that sense, then one would need to think about the nature of change in a separate dimension and how they then fit together. So in my work, I tend to follow the former pattern. My main concern is with the physical, and I do argue for an account of knowledge which is physical. so that in fact our knowledge, wherever we find knowledge, is grounded in certain types of patterns, maybe patterns of neurons, maybe patterns of, which you find in computers in a sense of a form of computer knowledge, maybe patterns we find in books in terms of written knowledge. So I'm strongly inclined towards the view that in fact a change in mental, it does correlate at least with a change in the physical. So I guess it sounds like you take a different view on that, which is certainly another popular view. So I'm not arguing for my view. I'm just saying.
From a policy perspective, obviously you focus on changes in behaviour, wouldn't you, and then have some quite improbable beliefs about how rational people were and how they would pursue well thought through goals through rational processes, which often don't work out.
Yes, I mean I think it's difficult to commit too closely to rationalism. I think one has to have a pluralistic and sort of rather broad-ranging understanding of what rational is. I wouldn't want to subscribe to a kind of rationalist, even rationalist philosophy as such. But I think that one could believe that humans behave in certain ways and tend to behave in certain ways. So one of the things that we talk about with these tendency laws, okay? So tendencies occur in both physical and mental domains. So if one gives somebody, a group of people, a drug, then the drug can tend to work, right? It could tend to improve some condition which those people may have. But for some people it may in fact be catastrophic, it may really make things worse. For some people it may work very well. And in the mental domain, this is even more true, right? You create an incentive, you set up a particular situation. And people may tend to behave in a way which, for instance, maximizes their utility, or in which they tend to follow incentives in the way in which was intended, but they don't always do so. And so what should think in terms, we promote the idea of thinking in terms of tendency laws rather than strict laws. So it's,
we had one in the corner. I think this microphone's turned up very sensitive, so I think the thing to do is hold it very close and speak quite quietly. See how that goes. We're getting a lot of feedback.
Okay, that's
so hold it very close.
Okay. Yeah, as you said, in order for one thing to sort of change to another, there needs to be some sort of element of similarity. But then you need sort of two distinct things, one of which is similar to the other thing. But that relation of similarity is, I think, subjective. You know, you need a human mind basically to sort of spot the difference effectively. But in the objective sense, as soon as two things are different, they are just different. So how could you establish any sort of objective relation in any sense? How could you say change is in any sense objective? Or we're just going to have to concede that change is always going to be a sort of figment of human imagination.
Yeah. So I think again, I can catch your name.
William.
William, thanks, William. Okay. I think it's a very good question. And I think this is a sort of question which is one reason that I sort of move away from the kind of neo-Humean view, because I think that this sort of challenge is much more acute for people who are taking kind of a state type position, which there are sort of separate states in time, and then it becomes very difficult to pick out what it is that is continuous through the change. So I think the challenge is different in sort of neo-Humean type, neo-Aristotelian work, which I can promote, because here you have objects, as I say, one can think of, a world in which these objects, God decided that he was going to create things that existed through time. So then one has, at the base of ontology, objects which do exist through time, and that's a kind of a starting point. And then the challenge is, of course, to recognise what they are, which may not be very clear, and to recognise differences within them. But the metaphysical challenge of saying what change is is much easier in that kind of neo-Aristotelian picture than the one where one simply has to mosaic and it's not clear what one first of all has to construct the things. And constructing, I think, sort of problem which you're pointing to, Williams, is the sort of problem which the neo-humans have with identifying things. Because it's not, if this is different, then how are we picking it out? How reliable is your ability to pick out this line of tiles and say for one line rather than just different tiles? I don't know if that helps.
Was that not a problem equally for the sort of Aristotelian perspective as well, in the sense that, you know, that there still are two distinct but different things when one changes from one thing to another, even if it is through time?
Well, I would argue not in the Aristotelian picture that one has a banana. The banana is a sort of thing which persists through time, and so it's not. I mean, ontologically, there isn't the same difficulty. If one thinks that bananas are sort of things that exist through time, then you can recognise them at one stage and recognise them at a later stage. And there are practical ways in which you can pick out the banana, right? You can put it on your shelf and you can watch it, and maybe you can film it, and you can kind of, it's just there. Okay, so there's you can kind of overcome an epistemic problem. But there's two distinct levels. There's the epistemic challenge of knowing that it's the same through time, but there's ontologically, one has a commitment to things that exist through time, then the challenge is much easier. But I think it's a very good question, and then I'm giving a rather sort of simplistic answer. There's a lot to be said about these issues. Thanks.
Thank you. Adrian, we've got one right next to you, so we'll skip the queue and then we'll do the two have been waiting next. So right in front of you, Adrian, and then we'll come to you.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Bridget. I just want to ask mainly a sort of more bringing it to daily life question. We've obviously been looking at philosophy at the level of debate from the old philosophers and so forth. Change clearly happens on two levels which affect all of us absolutely organically, which is life and death, which is maybe a physiological process, biological process, or maybe bigger than that. And then also just in society, huge changes. What drives change in society? You know, it affects all of us daily, and we can see it moving. And those two fundamental aspects of change, in a more day-to-day aspect, how would you be applying what you've been sharing with us tonight, which is all very interesting, into those day-to-day experiences that we all have, and which philosophy is so fundamental to?
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks. Great question. Okay, so in our work, a lot of the practical examples that we are dealing with in terms of policies are very much at that second level that you talked about. We're not really, in the book with Cartwright that I mentioned at the end, we're not really looking at change in the physical sense of organisms living and dying. We're often, most typically, looking at social examples, such as the ones I mentioned about schooling or about policies of welfare. Often, actually, some do exist in the medical sphere as well. Those are questions about what causation has occurred there. And I think you're right, they're hugely complex questions as to what has caused what. And in a sense, that's, the whole reason there's a need to write the book, because we're not just concerned with the question of, if we introduce this policy, will it in the future cause this particular change? We were also being very much focused on the separate question, which is a related question, which is this policy was introduced 5 years ago. Did it in fact produce the change which we thought it would bring about? And so those sorts of questions, even historically, are very difficult to judge. So you really need to go back and dissect the information and look at what we thought the process was and the evidence for it. When one looks at it historically, you can often find trace type evidence, fingerprint type evidence of what has gone on, which gives you a clue to the type of processes which have actually happened. But it is, in a sense, a wonderfully rich task to try and work out the nature of change within at a society level, in which the change can be quite subtle, and the answers to the question are not straightforward. It's not necessarily a question of it did cause it, didn't cause it, how it caused it, the extent to which it caused it, and what other effects it brought about. And there's always a need in all these cases to think about it. And there's no substitute in these cases for expertise in the particular society, in a particular area, whether that's child welfare, whether that's education, whether that's medicine, to really understand the nature of the change and to look at the detail in each case. So thanks for the question.
We might do a quick microphone swap because I think that's getting worse and worse. So, John, if I give you this,
Sure.
and then take that, and then just here as a question.
John, thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Jeff. I think my question is about the objective identification of cause and effect. I think quite a few scientists believe that the universe is actually an evolving complex system which gives rise to emergent properties. And I wonder what this means for the ability of human beings to actually identify cause and effect.
Yeah, Jeff, yeah, that's a great question. And well, as with Michael, let's agree we're not going to go into the quantum domain thinking of that. But even before that, we can think of the complex world as I agree, not presenting us with necessarily clear causes and clear effects. Indeed, so is this on?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I think in a sense that when one thinks about the underlying processes, then the causes are in a way constructed as types of states or types of events, for example, out of a kind of a nexus of underlying complexity and change, the sort of world in which I think you were kind of alluding to, which I agree that is kind of that complex evolving world is the one which we face. And so what we're left with is I think the task of trying to identify from this complex world when we have an instance for a particular type of event, a particular type of state. And that is skill which provides an epistemic challenge. And I don't think that there is an easy answer to that. So identifying causes, I think, always is a pragmatic issue rather than one which could be done entirely objectively. And I guess, you know, if I talked about Nancy Cartwright, Cartwright talks in her book in '99, The Dappled World, about this complexity of the world, about this subtlety of the world. The world for Cartwright is deeply dappled, so she is very skeptical about the existence of simple and objective laws which apply everywhere across the world. And she puts in their place rather a need to look at the individual context and to understand the variation in nature and pay due regard to that, and I hinted at some of that in my talk. And this kind of underlying complexity which we need to, which we're dealing with, which is the reality, is the challenge, and that's so we need to recognise the dappled world. But having said that, we still believe that often one can pick out types of causes, right? One can pick out, you know,
neurotransmitter particles arriving in a synapse. One can pick out turning the key, or in simple engineering examples, for instance, as being types of causes and effects, and we can recognize some types of effects. So I don't think that the position is hopeless. I think that often we can pick out useful causes and effects, and we could use them to good purposes in a pragmatic way, both in our everyday life and in science. But it's always a challenge, and we should never think it's as simple as straightforward.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you.
And final question. Final question.
Hi, thank you very much, John, for your lecture. I noticed that in your presentation, my name is George.
Hi, George.
That you focused mainly, maybe perhaps I'm wrong, on the objectivist view that time is something that is absolute, something that exists outside of human experience, for example, right? That's the position of Russell, as I understand it correctly. But I wanted to hear your take on the existentialist position, like particularly Heidegger, on the concept of time and change, because I think he proposed a completely different view than it's of those you mentioned. So it would be really nice to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, George. Well, Heidegger's not my particular area of expertise, but certainly there are philosophers that think that time is more subjective and about experience than necessarily being objective. And I guess that my own work is on sort of physical ontology rather than on sort of the mental ontology, the sort of views that Heidegger took. So I guess I tend to focus on those areas, the views that are concerned there. So I'm not sure I have a huge amount to say, I'm afraid. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, George. We can continue that discussion maybe afterwards.
Yeah.
Well, our next talk is on 25th of June, and this will be the philosophy of flirting with Lucy MacDonald. Sorry, this will be Lucy MacDonald on the philosophy of flirting. Lucy recently provided, I like this quote, a long overdue philosophical model of flirting in the Routledge Handbook of Philosophy of Sex and Sexuality, and she's going to talk about how flirting is a process, John, I think. Yes, it's not enough for different people to be flirting at different points in time. It has to be a single process, and she'll talk about how you can use that model to argue against abuses of the notion of flirting by perpetrators of harassment and assault. So I think it's going to be a very interesting session on applied philosophy. So do book on for that if you'd like to come. osoarts.org.uk/philosophy club. I'd like to say thank you to Robin for manning the slightly reduced IT. He's looking much more relaxed than usual. And to Graham for skipping around so ably around taking questions. Thanks to everyone for your questions tonight, which we enjoyed very much. And thank you very much to John for the talk. Thank you.